Upon hearing this news, Hill was not particularly surprised. Otto followed up saying, despite many ministers advising against it, the king had resolved to proceed. The army had already started requisitioning grain, and Otto predicted that they would march as soon as the heavy snow had completely melted. By then, the royal knights, along with Duke Kabu, who rules the western region, would set out on the campaign. It was then that Hill realized why the price of porridge had recently increased by a copper coin. Otto also learned from merchants returning from the west that many refugees had appeared near the old holy city. Perhaps something had happened in Hermes. Hill nodded, as this info should be sent to Neverwinter as soon as possible. Otto hesitated and became much more serious as he addressed the second matter. He recalled that during last week's court session, their nation's foreign minister expressed concerns that Roland had not held a coronation ceremony and heard rumors that many nobles in the Grey Castle were against his ruling. Given the hostility between the two nations, the minister suggested they should secretly support those nobles. Hill's expression turned grave, curious about King Anpian's response. Turned out, the king did not reply immediately, but he seemed quite interested in the idea. Otto didn't know why he felt compelled to share these matters with Hill, especially as their nation's relationship had deteriorated. His family had served the royal family for generations, yet he could not bring himself to accept the new king's policies, particularly how Anpian aimed to kill all of the witches. And this might put Andrea in danger. He knew too well that Andrea was not like those pure ones from the church. However, his attempts to persuade the king only alienated him further. Whenever Otto looked at the young king now, he no longer felt the same respect he had with the old king, and their friendship seemed to fading away. Hill nodded, reassuring Otto that the plan against Roland would not succeed. Otto hesitated, his cheeks reddening as he asked for updates about Andrea. Hill explained that Andrea had first returned to Slumbering Isle and had recently come back to Neverwinter. With a smile, Hill told Otto not to worry since Andrea was in good hands. Their conversation drifted to less serious matters until they were interrupted by a discordant argument outside. Soon, both turned towards the door. Otto sent a maid downstairs to check on the disturbance, thinking perhaps someone had drunk too much, just as he tried to learn more about Andrea's situation. However, Hill interrupted him and leaned quietly against the door. Hill heard noises, armor clanking, iron boots stomping the floor, and sword hilts colliding with the floor and furniture. These people clearly were not drunkies, these were armed men. The maid never returned to the room, and that's not a good sign. He didn't want Hill to get the wrong idea, so he tried to assure Hill that it wasn't him. Hill quickly walked towards the secret passage leading to the back garden, telling Otto to not worry as he trusted him. Hill knew he needed to leave now, telling Otto to leave with him. However, he was prepared to hold off the people to ensure Hill's safe departure. Hill urged him again, since this is not within Otto's family territory, but Otto believed he wasn't the target, since he hadn't shared his contacts with Roland or his efforts to save witches with anyone else. Staying behind would allow him to explain himself better and ensure Hill's safer escape. Hill let out a sigh and wished Otto good luck. Quickly he entered the secret passage. Moments later, the door was kicked open, and a squad of fully armed knights crowded in. Without a word of explanation, they seized Otto. Otto angrily demanded to know if they were aware they were violating an earl's territory and accused them of rebellion. The bald leader of the knights smirked coldly, retorting that it was not they, but Otto, who was plotting a rebellion. Despite the accusations, Otto stood firm, shouting back that it was nothing but slander. The soldiers, ignoring Otto's protests, tell him that he will have to explain everything to the king himself. Otto was arrested and didn't get to see the king until 2 days later. During this time, Otto protested by refusing to eat, continually demanding to see Anpian. When Anpian finally appeared, he didn't seem pleased. Anpian only wanted to tell Otto to eat well, and was about to leave. Otto, grasping the bars of his cell, demanded to know why this was happening and where his family was. Anpian didn't answer these questions right away. Instead, he informed Otto that this was the palace dungeon, and the cell was built to the standards of a duke's residence. Otto then tried to explain, but Anpian cut him off with a cold smirk, gripping the bar, and shouted to him that he didn't want to listen to any of his lies. Anpian revealed that he had spent months tracing the faintest clues about witches and was shocked to discover Otto's involvement. All of Otto's dealings, meeting York, rescuing witches, and aiding their escape. To Anpian, these actions were utter betrayals. In his eyes, witches deserve to be in hell. And the letter Roland wrote to him is nothing but a betrayal of their alliance. Anpian pointed out that their past friendship was the only thing sparing Otto from the gallows. Regarding the three families, Anpian is still in need of them, however, that's not for long. Otto felt a chill descend upon him as he listened to Anpian's harsh words, seeing a viciousness in his eyes, and the red-armored soldiers that Otto had never seen before. He realized that since the old king's death, the three families had completely lost Anpian's trust. As for Otto's father, he was unharmed and attended the court session as usual. Before leaving, he turned to Otto, advising him to stop his hunger strike and warned that if Otto continued to be obstinate, Anpian might resort to more drastic measures. Meanwhile, back at Grey Castle, somewhere in the Northern Territories, snowflakes still floating in the chilly air. A group of soldiers huddled around, some keeping watch, others warming themselves by a fireplace. The captain of this squad, peering through binoculars towards the distant snow-capped mountains, checked his rifle and reminded him of the battle just a few months ago that still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the veiled witch whose terrifying powers had brutally slain nearby soldiers. Despite knowing she was the enemy, witnessing her struggle against countless bullets had left him with a deep unease. If not for his loyalty to the king, he might have already left the army to pursue a simpler life. A soldier behind him prepared to fetch some firewood. However, it was still their duty time, and everyone was supposed to remain on post. Meanwhile, an older soldier reassured him with a chuckle, saying no one would mind given the bitter cold. After all, several months had passed since the last sighting of the church's forces. Convinced by his words, the captain nodded and sent him to help gather firewood more quickly. He then lifted his binoculars again, scanning the snowy terrain. This time, he spotted figures moving in the distance. Turning around, he shouted to alert the others, and all the soldiers gathered around him. He carefully wiped his binoculars and looked again to confirm. Indeed, there were people approaching their position. As the sound of the horn echoed across the plains, everyone got to their positions. The entire squad quickly arranged themselves into combat formation. A younger soldier asked if the approaching group could be from the church. The older soldier said it had to be the people from Hermes, although he wasn't sure if there were going to be those terrifying god punishment warriors this time. The captain loaded the machine gun. As the distance closed to about 1,000 meters, he noticed something odd. These people didn't seem to be knights. They wore no armor and their clothing was thin and ragged, looking more like refugees to him. But there's also a chance that they were god punishment warriors in disguise. However, he knew if he couldn't confirm these people's identities if they came too close to the post, they would surely be shot. He's also not certain if these people carried those pills that would make them frenzied. Rushing forward, he could clearly see that each person appeared extremely weak. He was almost certain that these people were refugees. He shouted for them to stop advancing or they would be shot. Instead of heeding his warning, the group, clearly spotting him, quickened their pace with excited expressions and waved their hands, seemingly relieved. The captain fired 2 warning shots into the sky, but this had no effect on the advancing group. The older soldier joined him, telling the captain that these people wouldn't know what a gun was, and they both continued to yell, but it was too late. The group had already entered the perimeter and crossed the wooden stakes. Shots rang out from behind, and several of them were shot. Alright guys, you can't have war crimes if the Geneva the Geneva Convention was not yet established. Anyway, the group finally halted. The captain quickly turned around and yelled at the man to cease fire. All of the people suddenly knelt down. Though visibly frightened, they did not turn around and flee. When asked where they were from, one of the people said they were from Hermes. However, they denied being followers of the church, saying that they had been deceived by the church this entire time. People began pleading for some food. With hands clasped together, they appeared desperate, and a woman shouted about her child being on the brink of death, while another person said he hadn't eaten for 3 days. The captain was moved and reached into his pocket for some rations, but an older soldier grabbed his arm, whispering urgently that these people were from Hermes, thus they have to be followers of the church and thus their enemies. The other soldiers gathered around. Some even said that these very people might have crafted the weapons and armor used by the church's armies. Perhaps some of them were part of the Judgment Army. The captain shook his head, urging his men to remember the time before the king came down to the border town. Back then, many of them had been deceived by the church. However, His Majesty never abandoned them. He argued that they should not abandon these people now. While those guilty of crimes must be held accountable, the first step should be to provide food and then individually interrogate them, as this is what the king had taught them. Despite some hesitation among the troops, the captain reminded them of the king's words in his book, stating that Grey Castle was a united community and that all who pledged allegiance to Grey Castle were its citizens. They should not reject these people or ignore their suffering, as doing so would go against the king's wishes. The soldiers fell silent for a moment until the older soldier smiled, finally understanding why Nail was chosen to be the captain. However, Nail still wanted to know what exactly had happened in Hermes. From the refugees, they learned that the cathedral in the new holy city had collapsed. According to the refugees, a massive sinkhole had suddenly opened underground, swallowing the entire building. No one knew exactly what had happened, and the area was now sealed off by the church. Rumors were rampant that the divine beings had abandoned them, leading many to flee Hermes. However, the church's forces relentlessly pursued the deserters. Their group used to be in the hundreds, and now only a few of them managed to make it here. Nail digested this information. Clearly, this is good news, and perhaps they could seize Hermes in no time. Meanwhile, on top of a giant wall, Tucker, dressed in the brand new pope attire, became a temporary pope. Looking into the distance, he had anticipated that demonic beasts would devastate Hermes and had prepared to die here. Yet, surprisingly, barely any demonic beasts attacked. What's worse is that no one had predicted the sudden collapse of the cathedral, causing nearly all of the church's leadership to disappear. To him, this was worse than losing the war to Grey Castle. Could it be that the divine being had truly abandoned them? Behind him, a woman spoke. It was Felina, the commander of the Judgment Army, who reported that the forces sent to chase the fleeing refugees had returned. Tucker knew this won't be good news. He was right, many troops had disbanded during the pursuit, with some choosing to flee as well. Felina, visibly frustrated, calling them traitors. Tucker let out a sigh and asked how many of them were left. Felina reported precisely 564 soldiers. Tucker turned around and decided that they should be heading east and build a new holy city there. Felina was shocked and wondered who would defend against the demonic beasts if they left. Tucker believed that preserving their strength was crucial now. To him, perhaps only when the demonic beasts rampaged through the four great kingdoms would people remember and turn to the church again. Tucker, being a higher-up, clearly knew about the demons. However, he avoided bringing them up, as those remaining were the church's most loyal followers, and the best he could do for now is to offer them was take them far away from the battlefield. Felina shook her head and then told Tucker that those determined to stay were devout believers, and all of them were ready to die for the holy city. They likely would not agree to abandon Hermes. Tucker smiled at her, while earnestly saying that it doesn't matter where they are, since whatever they are standing on, that is the holy city. Hoping Felina could persuade them, he paused briefly before adding that this was also his command as the acting pope. Just then, the gray sky brightened with a tinge of brightness as the sun emerged, signaling the official end of the months of the demon. Tucker smiled again, instructing Felina to begin preparations for their departure within 3 weeks. Felina, much more relieved, hurried to make arrangements. As Felina walked away, Tucker remained behind. He removed his crown, placing it atop the wall, then climbed the city wall to gaze into the distance at the setting sun. Closing his eyes, he leaned forward and jumped off. The sound made Felina halt and turn back, and Tucker was no longer there. Maybe in Tucker's mind, he lost hope, or perhaps to him, only by doing this, could make everyone truly abandon Hermes. Back in Neverwinter, Roland gathered everyone in the main hall where a large banner hung on the wall, inscribed with Spring Cultivation Campaign. Roland started off by saying the use of the term campaign might have puzzled some, but Roland explained that the upcoming efforts were crucial to the successful implementation of this year's strategic plans. He emphasized the importance of ensuring that no one in Grey Castle would go hungry, a goal he had managed to achieve over the past 3 years. Stability in the kingdom, he argued, depended on everyone being well fed. This will be an assessment of everyone here whether they can meet the standards necessary to manage different areas of the territory. Roland then unveiled the criteria for this year: 50,000 hectoliters of grain. This number surprised many. For most of them, this almost sounded fantastical. Roland followed up and explained that with the use of the second-generation golden seed, the newest variety of seed being tested in the fields, yields had doubled compared to the first generation, producing so much that the tip of the wheat was heavy enough to bend the stalks. Everyone was aware of how high the yields from the first-generation golden seed fields had been, and the idea of doubling such a number seemed almost miraculous. Roland then allowed Leaf to explain further. To make things simple, the second-generation golden seeds could only be planted once. The seeds were engineered using magic to absorb nutrients from deeper layers of soil, which also meant they required more fertilization as well. After Leaf's explanation, Edith was the first to raise a question. She was curious whether the wheat catalyzed by magic was safe for consumption by ordinary people. Roland patiently clarified that although the seeds were developed by Leaf using her ability and were modified by magic, they did not contain magic themselves, making them safe for consumption by ordinary people. He reassured everyone by sharing that his own recent meals had all been sourced from seeds. The policy will be mostly the same for this year as well. Farmers can still sell their excess grain to the municipal hall. Shortly after, Spear, raising a practical concern, asked if the second gen would produce too much surplus. If, like before, all surplus grain were to be bought by the municipal hall, it could put a lot of financial pressure on the municipal hall. She specifically mentioned the situation in her territory, Dragonfall Ridge, which had only 10,000 residents. She questioned whether such a small population also needed so much as well. Roland nodded and explained that any surplus grain would be stored somewhere. He spoke with gravity, emphasizing that these reserves were crucial for the upcoming Divine War. After the meeting came to an end, Roland arrived at the dock. He was warmly greeted by the returning group of witches from the snowy mountains. Among them was Nightingale, who flew into his arms with a light chuckle, while whispering, "I'm back." Roland gently admonished her not to be so reckless in the future. Nightingale nodded, then shook her head, saying how she couldn't turn blueprints into reality like Anna, and that supporting Roland in her own way was all she could offer. However, staying by Roland's side is the most important thing to her, so she promises that she won't put herself in danger again. Hearing this, made Roland blush a little. As Nightingale's figure faded, other members then approached Roland. Lightning, with a wave of her arm, jumped onto Roland enthusiastically. Even Agatha smiled softly as she gave him a gentle hug. However, the god-punished witches looked at him earnestly. It was clear they were all aware of the dream world. Despite knowing that they all are girls from the inside, it was still a peculiar feeling for Roland to be gazed upon by these tall and muscular male bodies. As the group busily unloaded the ship, Roland found himself encircled by the Takira witches. Back in his office, Roland found Nightingale already waiting for him at his desk, having also heard about the dream world and how the Takira witches could enter it. Roland briefly explained how it worked, but Nightingale didn't respond, rather pouted and provocatively placed her bare foot on his knee. Roland looked at her and yelled that there was no way he would ever allow Nightingale to turn herself into a god punishment witch, just so that she could enter the dream world. Despite her attempts to explain, Roland didn't want to listen. He didn't believe the dream world would exist forever, and moreover, it was being eroded by some mysterious force. How could he allow Nightingale to live encased in a body forever devoid of sensation? Nightingale, head bowed and pouting, was at a loss for words. She sighed, feeling it unfair that others could access a place she believed only Roland could enter. Roland chuckled, gently laughed, and explained that the sacrifices the witches made were unimaginable. Enduring centuries without physical sensations was hard to bear, and Nightingale should not envy them. Placing his hand over hers, he reminded her of her promise to stay by his side for life, playfully adding that he didn't want a muscular and bearded god punishment warrior constantly by his side. Embarrassed, Nightingale turned her head away, looking quite adorable. Seizing the lighter mood, Roland then asked if she'd like a cup of chaos drink, to which she quickly turned back and nodded vigorously. As they sipped their drinks, Roland thanked Nightingale for her role in keeping everyone safe. He stressed without Nightingale, everyone would be in danger. Chewing her dried fish, she waved it off and said it was nothing. Roland thought otherwise, since losing the exploration team would be a detrimental loss to Grey Castle, and to him. Telling Nightingale that she was as indispensable as Anna was, hearing this, made Nightingale blush a little, and she quickly changed the subject and asked what Roland meant by his dream world eroding. He tells her not to worry, since whatever happens in the dream world will not affect him. However, he was curious about the deeper mysteries it held, especially concerning a certain textbook on Olympiad mathematics. Initially, many books he encountered in the dream world had been blank, since he never read these books before. However, what should have been blank was now filled with content, despite he never having read it. He wondered if this meant that all the things he hadn't seen before would eventually restore themselves in the dream world. His thoughts deepened, and he became so engrossed that he didn't notice his hands had unwittingly moved to Nightingale's legs. A couple of minutes passed, and it was Nightingale's voice that brought him back to reality. Looking down, he realized where his hands were. He quickly retracted his hands, and Nightingale, slightly blushing, wondered if she should go take a shower first. Roland felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He didn't mean to do it, he was too engrossed thinking about the dream world, but the feeling wasn't too bad after all. Just as he was trying to figure out how to explain himself, there was a knock on the office door, and Nightingale dived into the mist. As Agatha entered the office, she noticed something odd about Roland's demeanor but quickly focused on the matter at hand. She informed him that all the materials had been transferred to the third border town and asked if he wanted to watch. Roland nodded and got up. However, Agatha paused and looked at him with concern, asking if he was feeling unwell. She heard some unusual tone in Roland's voice, which prompted her worry about his health. Given that the month of the demons had passed but it's still really cold outside, illnesses were rampant and Roland might get sick. She wanted to call over Lily first before they headed over to the third border town. Nightingale, who had been standing quietly behind Roland, let out a soft chuckle in the mist.